I have to say a huge thank you to Johnny and the team here at Messums, because I wouldn't be in the room today without their support. I'm going to take you on an incredible journey of adventure, and it's going to be taking us twice around Antarctica, and we're going to finish up in the Arctic. So as we go on this journey, I'm going to be sharing my experience as to how I felt sustainability and as I became more interested and more engaged with that climate action now message. And I'm going to take you on a pretty wild adventure across the Arctic as well. So I'm going to kick us off with a little video to just sort of set the scene of what it's like sailing solo in Antarctica. If I can get the clicker, there we go. Everything was like mounting up. And after 5 days of just extreme sleep deprivation, I just felt like I couldn't keep going. I felt like the world was telling me not to go, and I started listening to those doubters, and I started listening to the naysayers that were saying, don't go, you can't do it.
I'm so close to home. Cabin's been demolished because I've just been ripping stuff apart. I just can't go through it again.
So raise your hands if you looked at that and thought, yeah, nah, Lisa can have it. Yeah, very smart people in the room. Who looked at that and thought, I couldn't do that? Perfect. I was exactly like you. I used to read these books of the great adventurers, your Robert Knox Johnson, Kay Coddy, Jesse Martin, all these incredible sailors. And I used to read their stories and devour them and think to myself, one day that would be amazing to do. But I couldn't do that. What makes me capable? I didn't even start sailing till I was 25, and I got a job as the cook and the cleaner on a charter boat, and I just fell in love with this lifestyle at sea. And it wasn't until a TV ad popped up, just one day, just by chance, on my screens, and it changed my mindset and it changed my life. And the punchline was this: just do, because the world is changed by doers. And until that point, I'd been thinking from a dreamer's perspective. I'd been consistently thinking that would be amazing one day, but I wasn't taking any real steps towards making it possible. Until this ad, and then I started thinking, well, how do I action it? What would be the steps if I wanted to go on a grand adventure like that? How would I have to make that possible, and what would I need to go through to get there? So that led me on a journey crossing oceans, and I eventually raced around the world with the Clipper Around the World Yacht Race. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with that race, as it's deep roots in the UK here. And as I raced around the planet, I got my first real exposure to basically how bad we are to our oceans out there. I remember leaving Cape Town in South Africa, and I'd been at sea for 20 days on our way to Australia. We were about halfway between Antarctica and Australia. And I sailed past, and I was helming this big boat. We had a crew of 16 people on board. And I looked out on the horizon, and there was just this funny thing there. I was like, what's that? I couldn't work it out. And as we sailed a bit closer, I realised that I was looking at a styrofoam box floating past in the middle of the Southern Ocean, 20 days from land. And that was the first time I thought to myself, well, what are we doing to our environment? We then sailed from there up towards China and across the North Pacific, and there were whole sections of that voyage where the pollution in the water was so physically thick that we had to assign a crew member to the bow of the boat to physically push the rubbish out of the way of the boat so that we could sail through. Again, it was that question of, what are we doing? What's going on here? And I decided at that point, or until that point, I've been feeling very much like the idea that one person couldn't mobilise change, couldn't create an impact because I was just one person. Sorry, am I using the mic a bit? Is it dropping out or is it just me? Okay, cool. Maybe. I'll try moving my fingers, hey? So I was out there and I was thinking to myself, as a single person, I didn't matter. My little plastic bag that I would take home from the grocery shop, or that one straw, or that one coffee cup, none of that mattered because it was just one person. I couldn't make a difference. And then I would read these stories and I was looking at this pollution and I was thinking, well, hang on, we've got 8 billion people on this planet. And if you've got 8 billion people thinking their bit doesn't matter, then we're going to continue to have this degradation of our world, and we're not going to have the changes that we need. So I started thinking, well, hang on, as an individual, how can I inspire other people to take on action towards their own climate journey? And so I decided that I was going to go and sail solo and unassisted around Antarctica in a world first, and I was going to tackle that record with the view of trying to use it to amplify this message of climate action now. So it took me 3.5 years, and in 2016, I finally was able to purchase my boat. She's a 50-foot open ocean racing yacht, and I purchased her with the view of sailing her around Antarctica. And at the same time, I launched this campaign of Climate Action Now. And I formally renamed the boat Climate Action Now so that I could force the media to use the words. And this is going back, 8 years now, and it wasn't really something that people spoke about at this stage, or there was still a very huge network of climate deniers. And so by forcing the media to use the name, I thought maybe I could create a positive association with with the message of Climate Action Now. I then went and collected post-it notes from people. And each post-it note is an environmental action on something that person is already doing. Sally has short showers. Joe turns the lights off when he leaves the room. Bob, he picks up rubbish when he walks his dog along the beach every day. And it was these micro actions that everyday humans were taking towards a better future. And I gathered them up and we turned them into this digital design, and then I wrapped my entire 50-foot ocean racing yacht in thousands and thousands of the community's actions, the community's messages. And this was no longer about a solo girl sailing around Antarctica, and more about how could I create and advocate an awareness of this climate action now. So finally, after 3.5 dreaming and planning and taking action towards this goal, in 2017, I set off with the intention of sailing non-stop around Antarctica. And I went straight into the named latitudes of the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and the screaming 60s of the Southern Ocean. And it's that giant storm belt of the bottom of the planet, and I was expecting to be down there for 3 months, all on my own. Now, this is an incredible challenge on its own, just existing and surviving down there, let alone trying to break an existing record. But I was doing it. I had sailed across the South Pacific Ocean, I'd rounded the infamous Cape Horn, I'd sailed across the South Atlantic Ocean, and I was just exiting the South Atlantic Ocean and about to enter into the South Indian Ocean when it all went horribly wrong. I'd been at sea for 72 days, and I happened to be on deck earlier that night doing my normal deck check, and everything looked good and felt good. I was in 6 to 8 metre breaking seas, so waves almost the height of this building. But that was kind of a normal day for me in the Southern Ocean. That was an average conditions. And the winds were about 35 to 45 knots. I know, I'm a little bit nuts, but normal world. And I knew I had a new storm coming through that day. So I thought, I'll go below, get a little sleep, get a 20-minute cat nap in, and then I'll be ready to tackle this next storm coming through. And as I lay in my bunk, I just heard this bang. And it was the most violent kind of ringing in my ears as something really dramatic went horribly wrong. And I realised that I'd broken a piece of rigging. And I jumped up out of my bunk and onto my engine box, and I looked out, and as I looked out, I thought it was something at the back of the boat, but everything looked perfectly fine. And then I turned and I looked to the front of the boat, and all I could see was my 22-metre mast just bending and flexing like a hula girl shaking her hips. And they absolutely should not move that way. And within a few seconds of me trying to clip my life jacket shut and get up on deck, I heard the next worst sound possible. And it was this gut-wrenching noise of metal on metal twisting and grinding, and it's amplified 1,000 times inside the boat as the whole boat shakes and shudders around me, and my mast came crashing down. I was 1,000 nautical miles from land, and I just went into my first survival situation. That night, it took me 4 hours of crawling around on the deck of the boat, and about 3 hours into this emergency, I was starting to suffer quite an extreme case of hypothermia. And I was losing the dexterity in my fingers and the ability to physically hold on. And I would have to look at my hand to shut it around the tools I was using to disconnect the rigging. But I knew I had to go to the bow of the boat to disconnect this forward piece of rigging. And at this point, I disconnected the very back piece there. Hang on, let's see if I can, oh, no, I've done something there. I pressed the wrong button. Okay. Trying to find the laser here. I've disconnected the back piece right here, and I've also disconnected this inner forestay line right here. And the next piece of rigging I needed to release was the forestay wire at the very bow of the boat, just here. And as I crawled to the front of the boat, I'm effectively anchored in this storm. And because the mast is tangled with the debris and everything's still on the deck of the boat, it's actually still trapped on the deck of the vessel. And so as these 6 to 8 metre waves are coming through, they're hitting the mast and the debris first and then smashing into the boat and driving the two apart and together again. And it was so much violence to it that it started to physically cut the boat in half. So by this point, I had a hole the size of a pretty large dinner plate on the deck of the vessel. And time was really running out. And as I crawled to the front of the boat, I realised the way it had fallen, it had blocked my access to the piece that I needed to disconnect up there. And as I looked at it, I tried to come up with a better solution, another option available to me, and I couldn't find another way. And the only two choices I could see before me was option one, was to take my screwdriver, kind of shove my hand under the piece of rigging at the front, put my screwdriver in the fitting, with my right hand kind of hug it, and then smash it out from there. But the minute I disconnected the inner forestay wire, there was so much force behind it, it had kind of whipped across the deck of the boat, this huge piece of metal. And if I was in the way, it would break my arm, shatter my ribs, or otherwise prevent me from being able to save the boat. The only other thing that I could think of in that moment in time, with the tools and the equipment available to me, was to physically climb over my safety rails, sit down on that bowsprit at the very front of the boat, completely exposed to these waves, and disconnect it from there. But I knew if I was out there, I would have a 50-50 shot of survival if I was lucky. I also knew I needed to tell somebody. So I went into the boat and I called my shore manager up, Jeff. And I said to him, I've disconnected the backstay and the inner forestay. And Jeff is one of those super bubbly, positive people. And he's like, well done, Lisa, well done. We're all behind you here. And I'd made national news across Australia at 5 a.m. that morning. And then I had to say to him, I've got to go out onto the bowsprit. And he sobered up really quickly. And he's like, okay, I understand. And then I had to tell him that if my personal location beacon, the beacon on my life jacket that calls home for an emergency, if that's activated, it's because I've been washed off the boat and I'm no longer attached. Don't come and rescue me. For me, that was going to be the only way that I could tell my family the ending to my story. And I hung up that phone and I crawled to the bow of the boat and I got 2 meters from the bow of the boat and I froze. I locked up in utter terror for what I was having to go through and what I was having to overcome to get out there. And I knew that it was no longer a case of would I survive the night, it was will I survive the next 5 minutes. And after about 20 minutes of being frozen and huddled and crawling and pinned to the side of the boat as these waves, which are now breaking clean across the deck, were battering me and dragging me down the decks, I finally just thought to myself, I've just got to do it. I've just got to do it. And I took a big, deep breath and I jumped up and I climbed over those rails and I sat down at the front of the boat. And as I sat down, I thought to myself, I could lock my ankles in underneath. Turns out I'm much shorter than I really thought I was. And I couldn't lock my ankles. So I was only able to hold on with the strength in my thighs. And in my left hand, I held my screwdriver and I was able to grip the rail at the same time. And in my right hand, I held my hammer. But it was too fat and I couldn't hold the rails. It's the pitch of night now. It's midnight in the middle of the Southern Ocean. And you can't see the waves coming, but you can hear the roar of the whitewater as this monster comes through. And you feel the boat lift as it crests towards the top of this wave. And a fraction before you reach the top, the wave will break. And this 8 to 9 tons of pressure comes bearing down on the boat. When it slams into the hull, it picks you up and it kind of tosses you to the trough of the wave. And then you get fully submerged in all the white water on the back end of it. I would have to hug the boat, hook my elbow and hold on as tight as I could. And on the back of that, I would then have to let go of the boat completely, put my screwdriver in the fitting, get my hammer and get 2, 3, 4 strikes with the hammer before I'd hear that next wall of white water. I honestly couldn't tell you how I survived that night. It was simply the process of continuing to take action towards a resolution. But I did survive the night and I was to eventually disconnect that mast from the boat. I've got a short little snippet here. The mast came down, and it came down to deck level, clean straight up. I prepared for it and the ship just in case, and the next my shore crew that I demasted and issued a 10 pairs. So the next day, I patched the repairs in the boat and I eventually rendezvoused with a container ship to do a fuel transfer at sea. They continued to say, come closer, we have fenders out. That's their fenders, 2 tyres hanging off the side of the ship. Needless to say, it ended badly, and I ended up almost losing the vessel the second time in as many days. And eventually, I built a new mast with the debris that I was able to salvage from the emergency, and I was able to motor myself and sail myself to South Africa. Now, until that time, I had complete trust in my vessel, and I was at peace on that boat in the middle of the ocean in these incredibly huge storms. But I didn't understand at that point how much I'd lost, how much it had taken from me, and it had changed my relationship with the sea. When I landed in Cape Town, I just knew I had to keep going. I had to continue to take this action. And so after 2 months of intense repairs in South Africa, I rebuilt the boat, found a second-hand mast that happened to fit the vessel, whacked it in, and I set off. And as soon as I left, I had this intense flood of negative comments. I had all these people saying, don't go, you won't come back, we'll just have to rescue you. Who do you think you are going into the Southern Ocean in winter? Now, I'd spent months researching the hysteric weather data, and I'd also emailed all of these people back, and I said to them, where's the data that says I can't do it? Just because it hasn't been done doesn't make it impossible. And nobody responded. So as I left, I come up with this philosophy, and I live by this, and I think this truly applies to our climate action as well. And it's that idea of only trim the sails to catch the wind you want. We live in a modern society where everybody has an opinion, but are they really opinions we should be listening to if they're not what our belief system is? And so for me, I chose to believe those who supported the project, who knew the boat, who knew what I was capable of, and I'd met and exceeded any concerns that were raised by those people. And so as I set off, I spent the next 6 weeks sailing across the Southern Ocean in winter, going through yet a series of whole nother challenges, snowstorms and blizzards. The boat was flipped completely upside down in a storm. But eventually I made safe landfall back in Australia 183 days after I left for the first record. Thank you. But for me, this was the start of my journey. That was my first record. And I landed broken in Australia because I didn't understand how a traumatic event like that would change a person. And I also knew I'd taken that trust I had in the sea from me. It took me 5 years to gather the courage and to rebuild myself, to feel comfortable and confident to go back into the Southern Ocean. And by this point, I'd carried that message of climate action now into the global media coverage and 20,000 nautical miles around Antarctica. But it hadn't achieved the results that I wanted. And so I wanted to continue to step it up and continue to do more for our environments. And so I made the commitment that I was going to go again. I was going to challenge that record. I had officially set the women's record as the first woman with one stop around Antarctica. But we're just humans. Why should I have a women's record when I could be the fastest person? And while I looked at that journey and that dismasting as a failure, the only true failure was really not trying, not going again, not continuing onwards, because that's the only time that you don't learn the lessons in life. So in 2022, just a few short years ago, I set off for the second time to go into the Southern Ocean. And I went straight down to 45 degrees south, straight into those storm conditions again, and I continued on. Only this time, I have been able to mix my passion, which is sailing, with that purpose of sustainability. And I will continue to advocate and do more work in this space. And when you combine those, I really feel like anything is possible. So me being me, I thought, this is a great opportunity. I'm going to raise my hand to scientists globally, and I'm going to put it out there and just see how much research I could do on this next adventure around Antarctica. It's a rather data-sparse part of our planet because it's so dangerous and hard for research to take place down there. And so with that, I was able to partner with a number of different organisations globally. And so as we continue on the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be breaking narrative sections for science talk, and I'm going to be explaining some of the research that took place. So this next little video I'm going to share with you is a short clip on how we converted the bow of the vessel into a micro lab at sea.
Hi everybody, how you going? So it's day 26 here, and I thought it's a pretty mild weather day, so I thought I'd take you through the science that's taking place on board the boat at the moment. So this is the Subsea Research Unit. So this does a lot of ocean health readings. It's been running 24/7, taking unlimited data, and basically it measures things like acidity, salinity, chlorophyll, PCO2, so it gives us an indication of how the health of the ocean is in this area of the planet. And there's not a lot of data that does that, so it's a really great little system. Then over here we have the microplastic sampler. So the water's coming in through a skin fitting in the bottom of the boat, comes through the Subsea Research Unit, and then pairs off and goes through this unit here. In this little device here I have the filters, and I have in there a 500 micron filter at the moment, and I'm about to change that out for a 100 micron filter that I'll run for 2 hours, and then I'll replace it with a new 500 micron filter, which we run for the other 22 hours. And this is the 500 micron sample size. The 100 micron is a much finer sample, and that's it.
So you heard me say a measurement there called PCO2. Now, PCO2 is effectively the amount of carbon that's present in the water. And it's a really interesting metric because the Southern Ocean itself actually absorbs like a carbon sink, and it saves 30% more carbon out of our atmosphere than any other ocean on the planet. So it's really valuable for us to get a bit of an understanding of whether it's healthy and whether it's doing its job or not. Now, all of that data has been sent up to Ocean Ops over in the global database for weather metrics, so scientists around the globe can draw from that data at any point. It's also on an Australian system called the Integrated Marine Observing Ship System. So it's up there for free for anyone to use globally. Now, the other part of that story is the microplastics, and that's what I'm going to talk a lot more about today because this is a real passion point for me, and I was quite alarmed with just the sheer volume I found out in the middle of the Southern Ocean. So microplastics itself is a plastic particle that is categorised as less than 5 millimetres in size. Now, because it's so small, it can spread so much further, and it enters the food chain at a much earlier state through our smaller microorganisms, and that it has a larger impact to our communities because of that. Now, what I found was actually on day 5 of my record, so just off the coast of Australia, I found the highest concentration of microplastics in the entire record. Now, this is scaled up for the volume of water equivalent to an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So everyone watched the Paris Olympics and the Olympic-sized swimming pool. So imagine finding 357,000 particles of plastic in that volume of water. Now, to me, that is terrifying that we're finding that increased volume down there. And unfortunately, when you hear things like every piece of plastic ever made still exists today, just because we can't see it with the naked eye or it's not as visible to us doesn't mean those impacts aren't still continuing across our oceans. Now, I sailed from there through an area of our ocean called Point Nemo. Raise your hands if you've heard of Point Nemo. Couple people? All right. So Point Nemo is also called the oceanic pole of inaccessibility. And it basically means you're in the most remote location on the planet that any human can get from any piece of land anywhere in the world. And I would actually end up closer to the astronauts in outer space than any human. Now, as I sailed through there, that microplastic sampler was continuing to sample 24/7 the entire circumnavigation. And sadly, I was expecting to find no plastic or very low levels of plastic because of how remote a location from land that this area was. But what we sadly found was an above average amount of microplastics, of 68,000 particles per an Olympic-sized swimming pool. This is a place where almost no humans exist, and there's certainly no, structures, there's no communities, there's no discharge lines for modern living in this area, but we're finding plastic. I then sailed. You can see that I've got this nice little storm here coming through. Where we see purple, that's an indication, we call it sort of 60 knots of wind, but at 60 knots of wind, you tend to lose the roof on your house. So I had a series of major storms come through, and it was 4 storms, each the size of a cyclone, one after another, just bashing into the vessel and absolutely pummeling us. And I really wish sometimes I would have a fly on the wall, because trying to change microplastic samples in 10-metre breaking seas was an extreme sport on its own. I'm going to show you a little video here. This is what I like to dictate as a bad knockdown. The wave that you're about to see is 8 metres high, just to give you a bit of context.
Hi everybody, how you going? So it's day 39, the day after the storm. So we've had some pretty big 7 to 8 metre seas around kind of all day. The winds have dropped to around 20-25 knots before they built back up to 35 knots. So I currently have the storm tip up and 2 reefs in the mainsail. For tonight's video though, I actually dug out the CCTV footage of the first knockdown from yesterday. So this is that knockdown. And then one of the key things you can tell about this knockdown is if you see this footage here, you can actually see the whole bow of the boat just getting absolutely shoved sideways by the force of that wave. And it's really hard to kind of capture this stuff on camera correctly, but between the 2 points of camera, you can tell that was quite a big impact on the boat. Lucky kind of actually now built strong stuff.
So on a normal storm, I would get 3 or 4 bad knockdowns, and I'd probably get 20 or 30 good knockdowns. And a good knockdown is just that, I don't get thrown across the cabin as violently. But I wear full body armour in my base layers the entire time that I'm sailing, so that I can combat these conditions. And I use a different variety of techniques to stay safe out there when I'm on my own. But I also get so incredibly desensitised, because I live in this extreme environment for months and months on end, that a knockdown like that, I'm still making my dinner halfway through, and I just kind of carry on, because what else are you going to do out there? The conditions cleared up enough for me to make a safe crossing of Cape Horn. Now, Cape Horn is considered the most dangerous section of our ocean to sail around. We call it the Mount Everest of sailing, and it's because what happens is you have this Drake Passage just here, which is between the Antarctic Peninsula and the South American coastline, and that is 500 nautical miles wide. But then what we have is these storms that span over 1,000 nautical miles in size. And they've gone the entire way around the planet, getting more aggressive and larger, and they suddenly hit that gap, and everything has to funnel and feed and compress through that section. So you get an exaggeration of the conditions once you round there. But I safely made my way around Cape Horn, and then I had to navigate through Iceberg Alley before sailing through the area of the ocean where I dismasted previously. So mentally, physically, I was at my wit's end. I'd done 10-minute micro sleeps for over a week, where I was sitting in front of my radar because there was such an intense fog around. I couldn't see the ice around me, so I had to do it from the radar at the bow of the boat. And then I basically just broke. I got up at 5 a.m. to change a microplastic sample, and I'd been shivering uncontrollably in my bunk for about 6 hours at this point, because my body had started to shut down from the extreme levels of fatigue. And all I needed was sleep, and absolutely the last thing I got was sleep. About 20 minutes after this photo, I thought I'd go to sleep, I'll just let the boat go slow, and I'll go below and I'll just rest. And then we got hit by a couple of bad knockdowns, so much worse than the others, and the entire boat was flipped completely upside down, and then the hatch of the vessel was ripped off, and then about 1 ton of water flooded into the cabin. So I went from my most extreme fatigued state to my next survival situation. But by continuing to take action, by continuing to work to that goal and continuing to meld that passion meets purpose, I was doing something remarkable. I was succeeding. And after being at sea for 92 days, I finally made safe landfall in in Albany in Western Australia. And I officially became the fastest person in the world to sail solo around Antarctica.
Today, sailor Lisa Blair was greeted by the Albany community as she made her way.
A little bit excited.
Setting a new record for the fastest non-stop unassisted solo voyage around Antarctica, coming in at 92 days, 18 hours and 14 minutes. 10 days faster than the previous record set by Russian Bedor Konyakov.
I was obviously quite excited to be reaching dry land again. That to me took 8 years from the day the idea was born to when I actually succeeded in that record. And that was a lot of pain, effort, challenges, immense challenges that I had to go through to overcome to succeed in that. But I actually think the largest thing that I celebrate out of all of this was the impact I've been able to generate for our communities. That was then labelled the largest microplastic survey of the Antarctic region in both the number of samples collected and the spatial distribution of those samples to ever take place. That to me means that it was worth it, that putting myself in a position of risk like that, to go out, to amplify that message, to create change, to mobilise action, it's worth it. Thank you. Now, the average we found across all those samples was 58,000 particles of microplastics in an Olympic-sized volume of water. And we were able to break the data down even further than that. And sadly, we found every single sample the entire way around had plastic. That, to me, shouldn't be occurring. And it's terrifying to think of what's going to take place over the next 30, 40 or 50 years as the larger pieces of plastic continue to degrade and become those microplastics. Now, we broke the data even further and we separated out fragments versus fibre. And we found that 64% of all the samples was fibre from the clothing and the textile industry. Now, I was quite shocked to learn that every load of laundry that we do as a household with synthetic fibres will release roughly, on average, around 300 particles of microplastics into your waste distribution systems. Now, I'm not too familiar with the UK system, but in Australia, that goes to our waste treatment plants. They don't filter for microplastics because it's too small, and all our wastewater goes into the ocean. So every single washing machine everywhere in the world is generating this unintentionally. It's that untold story of impact. Now, for the other 35% we found, it was all considered secondary plastic, meaning that it's come from a larger plastic item, such as a takeaway container, a water bottle, or a larger piece of plastic, and it's broken down from there into smaller and smaller pieces until it's eventually categorised as microplastics. I did find one piece that was considered a primary piece of plastic, and that was a microbead, knowingly found from like a skincare product, like an exfoliator. It's quite often found in toothpaste back in the day. And I pulled that out in a single sample in the middle of the Southern Ocean. Now, this is scary information. You should be scared. It is daunting and can be overwhelming. But you as an individual have the power to create change. You have the power to create an impact. And here are just a few simple suggestions of things that you can do that will make a difference. You can encourage your friends, you can talk to your community around you and mobilise people to continue to take on these actions. So some of the very simple things is remove or reduce the amount of synthetic fibres you actually own or that you're purchasing. Try and buy the natural fibres where you can. It's not always possible, but you can offset that. You can buy a filter for your washing machine, so you actually capture the microplastics before it goes to your waste treatment plant. And there's a number of different companies online. You just do a quick Google search and you can find a variety of different products for different price ranges online. Now, I didn't realise this at the time, but 30% of all microplastics is generated from car tyres. So these days, they're a blend of rubber and plastic. And so as we drive our vehicles, we're not just expressing, getting CO2 into the emissions, but we're also eroding microplastics onto the road, and then you get a heavy rainfall, ends up in the river, and then it finds its way to the sea. Now, you can also invest in quality products. We have such a materialistic lifestyle these days where we buy cheap items with the intention that we'll replace it in a year when it breaks. And instead, let's start investing in local products, local handmade products particularly, and stuff that can be repaired rather than replaced. And I think one of the most underutilised actions that people can take as an individual to impact the future is actually being aware that you're voting with your dollar. Just doing a simple action of going to the grocery store, you are voting for what type of items you want to see in that store. 9 times out of 10, every product you're trying to buy, there will be a sustainable choice available to you. And it's a supply and demand game. So if we're buying the products wrapped in plastic, chemically loaded, and terrible for our planet, then there's going to be more demand for that, so they're going to continue to make those. But if we start putting our dollar into the plastic-free packaging, the chemically free, the local grown, locally sourced, those items, then there's going to be more demand for that, and we'll be fueling the shift in the market. So you all have the power to create change. It just starts with that one action. Now, that Post-it note campaign, sorry, my throat. That Post-it note campaign of Climate Action Now, I invite you to participate and get involved with that. I have some Post-it notes down near the front of the entrance there, and I also have a bit of information, which is a summary you can take home of all the microplastics that I researched in Antarctica. So you can go and have a bit more of a read, and there's a little bit more information in there. Now, I so far have generated 8 world records in my sailing. I've done a number of other projects, and my projects started as a way for me to just have adventures, but they've become a way to storytell, to engage with communities like yourself, to mobilise action. So I want to share with you what's coming up next, because it's pretty amazing. And I want to invite you to support this project and get involved if you've got any network or suggestions in the future. Now, as I've dove into this microplastics issue, I looked into other stresses on our oceans, and I started to learn about some horrifying impacts of fiberglass. Now, we currently have between 35 and 40 million fiberglass boats reaching their end of life now. And this is over 50 years of production of fiberglass vessels. But what happens is the very last owner of the vessel is the least capable of disposing of that boat. And so what they find is they get purposely sunk or abandoned. And in Europe alone, they estimate there's 6 million fiberglass boats reaching their end of life, and 1% of those every single year get abandoned or disposed of. And they then worked out that 2,000 of those got disposed of correctly in landfill, and the other 6,000 to 9,000 they found were either sunk in known waters or abandoned on shores and riverways and estuaries. But the other 90,000, they don't know what happened to them. They just disappear. Now, in the UK, there's no requirement for you to register your vessel, so it's quite a big problem for here. It's an equally large problem in Australia. And there was a harbour in Chichester. They did a study, and they sampled 1 kilo of oysters, and they worked out that it had over 11,000 shards of fiberglass in 1 kilo of oyster. Now, this is insane because the boating industry this year is pledged to get up to over $9,000 million dollars in revenue. It's doubling every single year, yet your average boat user will use their vessel for 2 weeks of the year. And out of the global pool of fiberglass production, we actually only recycle around 30% of it is chopped up and used as fill in cement, but the rest goes to landfill. Now, as governments and policy changes are starting to take action on the abandoned vessels, but nobody's actually trying to tackle the source of the problem, the actual manufacturing of fiberglass. And how can we transition that to something that might be recyclable and create a circulability structure out of this industry? And so me being me and having my climate action campaign and being uniquely placed in the yachting community, I'm tackling this challenge. So I found a material, it's an existing material and boats are already getting made out of it, called basalt fibre. And it's volcanic rock that's been crushed down and they heat it back up to lava and then they pull it into strands, weave it into fabric, and then you can build boats out of it. Now, it's 10 times stronger than fiberglass. It's almost as strong as carbon fiber. It's the same weight as fiberglass, but it's 100% recyclable. So we can use this material onwards and onwards and onwards. So you can have a little look at a sample that I've got here just to have a little feel. Now, the goal is to basically take this material, fund the commercial required research to match this with the right recyclable, scalable bioresin, and then open source that data globally. Now, there's companies like these that are already building boats out of this material, but no one's been willing to share the data because they all want to kind of make the money the bottom dollar at the end of the day. So as the adventurer, I'm going to fund that research and then open source that globally. So I've designed a 30-foot vessel that I'm going to build out of basalt fibre and bioresins. And I'm going to take this boat all the way to London, because, you know, why not? I'm dual citizen with the UK as well, so it makes perfect sense to run this project from the UK. So I'm going to complete a London to London solo, non-stop and unassisted circumnavigation of the Arctic Circle. Now, it's never been done before by any human, and it's only possible because of climate change, because of the ice melting up there. And so the goal is to use the storytell of that record to educate around the why we need to start investing in the the volcanic fibre. And it's also to then continue the microplastics research, the ocean health data in the Arctic, get the corresponding set of data, and then use the school education program that I've already got and I'm continuing to develop so that we can inspire and engage with our next generation of change makers. So I estimate this project to be around 10 million in budget. I am looking for partners, so if you happen to have a contact or a suggestion of somebody I should reach out and talk to. Likewise, I'm looking for researchers to partner with from a scientific point. So again, if you have a suggestion of somebody to reach out to, please come and have a conversation, because I'd absolutely love to have a chat about it. And the project of the Climate Action Now is an ongoing project. And so if you complete a Post-it note message today, it will make it on my boat and go around the Arctic Circle with me. So please have a think of something you do that helps the planet and add that to a Post-it note. And I'd love to see you go on that journey with me. Now, I've achieved a lot. I've got a lot coming up. It's going to be a hugely hard challenge to undertake. It's a world first for a reason. But if we continue to take action, and we continue to find solutions, and instead of consistently dreaming about what future we want, we start working towards that future together, we can create the impact we want. So I invite you to continue to engage with this Ocean Symposium today. We've got a lineup of an incredible range of speakers. We've got Tessa's beautiful art as the backdrop for today, and it's so impactful. So inspire yourselves, engage with people, and I can't wait to speak with you further as the day goes on. Thank you, everybody.